Okay, let's talk about something you probably don't think about much: trash. But this isn't about your weekly pickup. No, this is a story about a high-stakes international conflict where millions of tons of garbage have become a geopolitical weapon between two of the world's closest allies.
And this number is at the very heart of it all. 3.46 million tons. Just let that sink in. That is the unbelievable amount of municipal solid waste that the province of Ontario trucks across the border to bury in Michigan landfills. Every single year. We're talking hundreds of tractor-trailers a day.
And this really puts the scale of that dependency into perspective. If you look at Michigan's own data, trash from Canada makes up almost 15% of all the waste that gets buried in the entire state. So you can see how this massive logistical pipeline has become, well, a huge vulnerability for Ontario and a major political headache for Michigan. So how in the world did a pretty simple arrangement for getting rid of garbage turn into a full-blown crisis? Well, that's what we're going to break down. We're going to dive into the economics, the politics, and the really surprising ways this whole trash war could end up reshaping the future of North American trade. It really all boils down to a fundamental economic imbalance. On one side, you've got Ontario, which is Canada's biggest province, and they are just rapidly running out of places to put all their garbage. And on the other side, you've got Michigan, which for decades has been a super cheap, super available, and really convenient solution. And when you look at the numbers here, it becomes so clear. Ontario's landfills, they're projected to be totally full by 2034 if that border gets shut down. Meanwhile, Michigan's got over 2 decades of capacity left. But the real kicker, the thing that drives this entire trade, is that bottom line. Michigan's state fee to dump a ton of trash has been a bizarrely low 36 cents. 36 cents? That incredibly low price created this powerful incentive to just, ship it all south. As you can imagine, this whole situation has now ignited a political firestorm, and it's pitting two powerful leaders directly against each other: Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Ontario's Premier Doug Ford. Both of them are taking some pretty aggressive and very different actions to solve this problem for their own people. So Governor Whitmer's strategy is really direct. Hit 'em where it hurts, right in the wallet. She's proposed a massive hike in that state landfill fee, taking it from just 36 cents a ton all the way up to $5. I mean, that's a more than 1,200% increase. It's designed to make Michigan a much less attractive dumping ground. But it's not just about stopping the trash from coming in. The plan is to take that estimated $80 million in new revenue every year and pour it back into Michigan's own environmental programs. Cleaning up contaminated sites, boosting recycling. Basically, they want to make the importers of the waste pay for the environmental costs. All right, so now let's flip over and look at Ontario's response, because they're facing the threat of a much more expensive border, or maybe even a closed one. Premier Doug Ford's government made a really dramatic move. They passed something called Bill 5, a controversial piece of legislation that basically gives the government these sweeping new powers to fast-track major projects by just bypassing the normal environmental rules. And this timeline for a new landfill near the town of Dresden shows you exactly how they used those new powers. So in early 2025, the government promised a full, rigorous environmental review. But then, right after passing Bill 5, they did a complete 180. They used their new authority to specifically exempt that exact same project from the assessment they had just promised. And, as you can imagine, that sparked a ton of outrage from local residents. So why the sudden reversal? Well, the government's justification was explicitly political. Premier Ford basically argued that with all the threats of tariffs and border closures coming from the Trump administration, Ontario had no choice. They had to, in his words, Trump-proof their own infrastructure and build new landfills, no matter the cost. And that's where the story just gets another layer of complication. Because this isn't just some local dispute anymore. It's actually governed by one of the biggest trade agreements on the planet. And there's this one single legal principle that's right at the center of everything. And that principle is called national treatment. So under the USMCA, that's the big trade deal between the US, Mexico, and Canada, you can't discriminate against goods from another member country. And here's the wild part. Under trade law, garbage is actually considered a commodity, a good, which means legally Michigan can't treat trash from Ontario any differently than it treats trash from, say, Detroit. So this all leads us to the million-dollar question, right? Is Governor Whitmer's proposed fee hike, which is very clearly designed to discourage Canadian trash, is it actually an illegal trade barrier under this huge agreement? Well, the answer, according to legal experts, is probably not. And it's actually a very clever piece of policy design, because that new $5 fee would apply to all waste. It doesn't matter where it comes from. That includes Michigan's own garbage. So technically, it doesn't discriminate. It manages to keep up this appearance of being trade compliant while still achieving what is, let's face it, a protectionist goal.
But wait, there's one final twist in all of this. The entire USMCA trade deal, it's actually up for a mandatory review in July 2026. This is kind of a sunset clause, and it means all three countries have to agree to renew the whole thing. This creates this incredibly high-stakes deadline where all the rules, including the ones about the trash trade, could just be thrown out and completely renegotiated.
So with all of this conflict and all this uncertainty, what's the actual long-term solution here? Well, if you look beyond the political chess match, there's a really fundamental shift happening in Ontario that could solve the root of the problem by moving away from landfills entirely and towards something called a circular economy.
And this solution is called Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. The idea is really simple, but it's also revolutionary. It shifts the full financial and operational responsibility for recycling away from cities and taxpayers and puts it squarely on the shoulders of the companies that actually produce and sell all that packaging. It creates one single, unified recycling system and, maybe most importantly, a powerful reason for businesses to use less packaging to begin with. And hey, this isn't just some pie-in-the-sky theory. As of January 1st, 2026, this new system is fully up and running across Ontario. We're already seeing hundreds of communities making the switch, new things like coffee cups being added to the recycling programs, and big waste companies making huge investments in new, modern recycling facilities to actually handle all this stuff. So, here's the bottom line. This Great Lakes garbage war is actually forcing a major change. All that political pressure from Michigan, combined with the threat of trade walls, is pushing Ontario to finally deal with its waste problem at the source. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question for the future. In a world that seems to be building more and more walls, could this conflict be the very thing that finally forces us to stop burying our problems and start treating our waste like the valuable resource it really is?